Hello and welcome to the Tax Post Budget Special. I'm David Williams.
And I'm Tumisho, Grater. Well, we do have a panel of experts that are joining us right here in studio. We are joined by Busisiwe Dweche, who is the Chief Executive Officer at BTMT Capital, Anthony Chait, Chief Executive of Zeridium. We've got Prof. Osman Molaji, who is the Chair of the SAICA National Tax Committee. And joining us live from our Cape Town studio, we've got Yaqub Jafar, who's the Associate Director for Corporate Tax at KPMG. Gentlemen and lady, lovely to have you here. Maybe let's just start off with what you made of the budget. Busisiwe, let me start with you. Was this the budget that you expected in terms of tax expectations? Are you convinced that we'll be able to meet those revenue targets?
In terms of expectations, I don't think so, Tumisho, but it was wisely crafted, you know. It was a good budget, considering that it is an election year, you know. But I expected him to touch on a lot of things, like increases on personal income taxes, you know, because we had an increase last year of 1%, and had we had another increase this year, we were going to have plus or minus 10 billion rands, you know, of revenue from those taxes, considering also that we have a burning need, you know, of funding the education. So because of not increasing much of taxes, it didn't quite meet my expectations.
Maybe I could put it to you first and then the other panelists answer. In the earlier program, we kind of reached a consensus, but a lot of those people weren't tax experts. You all are. So now we can really get the authoritative view on this. And that is that if you look at the proposals, personal income tax relief, not increase, relief. We're expecting to be hit hard here. Medical tax credit, that's relief, not increase. 30 cents a litre in the general fuel levy, well, maybe that would have come in a normal budget. And all the point, tire levy, tax on sugar sweetened beverage, very interesting tax, and the usual alcohol and tobacco increases. That's a business as usual kind of tax increase, isn't it?
It is a business as usual, David. You know, the only thing for me which was interesting is that increase in sugar taxes. It won't be much, but obviously anywhere where we can get revenue, it would be useful. But now think about this. There's an increase in excise duties, and then if one stops drinking alcohol and then you go to sugar sweetened drinks, you'll still be stuck with taxes. Yeah.
David, just to the point that Dumi put to Busu earlier, where I think there is scope for collecting is obviously capital gains tax rates have gone up across the board, trusts, individuals, trusts, and companies, and they're reasonable increases, and people are selling assets all the time. So I think we'll get some there. I think the big ace that the minister had up his sleeve, and there are more questions at this stage than answers, is the amnesty. This is a repeat of the amnesty that took place in 2003. The wording is very similar, and I think tens of billions of rand are going to be collected as part of that process.
Yeah, I think in terms of expectations, I think yes and no. In line with expectations, in the sense that we knew, or we were expecting at least an extra 15 billion to come in increases in revenue. So I think that's not entirely unexpected. What was unexpected is that I think the minister found the additional revenue in slightly more creative ways than we expected. We knew that there was either one big tax increase in one area or little bits and pieces, and he cobbled together bits and pieces to get to his 18 billion. I think the important issue, though, is that if we were to ask the question, are we going to be slightly worse off as individuals from a tax perspective, I think there's no doubt, because if we had to say we were expecting another across-the-board 1% increase in personal income tax, then all of us would have, from a perception perspective, known that we're slightly worse off. The relief that you mentioned, and that's really where we get to the actual numbers.
So let's start with that, and let's move through, as he divided up what he thought was important, let's move through those points. This personal tax relief of 5.5 billion, it sounds a lot. Is it? How important is this? How does this fit the mix?
Okay, and I think that's a critical point. And when we say relief, we mean expected relief of 13 billion, and we're getting 5.5. So actually what's happened is 7 billion has gone back to National Treasury in not giving us the relief that we've been accustomed to over the past few decades. So that's what, so it's framed like that.
That's not how he put it.
Yes. Yes. So let's be clear. This is effectively for most of us the equivalent of a 1% increase in tax rate. By all of us, well, certainly I think most of us around the table will be expecting to get an inflationary adjustment to our salaries, and that's what puts you into the higher tax bracket. That fiscal drag relief, which is, it's been part of our budget since forever, that's where we're getting the, well, 7 billion at least of the extra 18 billion.
Jacob, let's bring you into the conversation there in Cape Town. Let's get a sense of your expectations. Is this the budget in terms of taxes that will help meet revenue? Osman seems to think that if you take everything into account, we actually is still a lot of pressure on the consumer.
Yeah, I certainly, in my view, my expectations in terms of the changes in the tax rates was definitely more on the personal income tax side, and possibly also an increase on the VAT side is what I speculated before the budget. So certainly the announcements made by the minister has come as a surprise to me, but what is welcoming to see is that he also mentions that there'll be expenditure ceilings be put in place over the next 3 years. So it's a match of the expenditure ceiling going with the tax rate changes as well that offset each other.
Let's stay with that personal tax relief. Anthony, looking at that area, Yanni Rousseau, who's from Wits and not a tax expert, but his view was at the top end there could have been extra tax brackets. So for people earning over $1 million, increase in what they pay, say by 2 or 3 percentage points. People earning 1.5 million, another bracket. 2 million and 3 million, which would do two things. He didn't say this, I'm saying it. It would raise money. Now it would be interesting to know what you would say, you experts, how much it would raise, whether it would have been worth it. It would also send a signal on inequality in society. We're actually looking at the very wealthy.
Yes, I think, David, that there was probably scope to put perhaps a super tax band on top. Currently, and this is the status quo's been retained, we hit the maximum marginal rate of 41% at around about 700,000, and that's remained the same. So I think a lot of people were expecting to have a sort of a super tax, perhaps at a higher rate, on levels of income, as you said, perhaps over $1 million. But I think that there's a wisdom in not doing so, and that is we need to look after the entrepreneurs who are going to, from where the growth in terms of GDP is going to come from, and you don't want to, as they say, kill the golden goose. So I'm not unhappy. Just touching on VAT, which was mentioned earlier, I think we are being softened for a VAT hike. Perhaps it'll be around about the time that we get more into the National Health and Insurance Scheme. That might be good timing to, even just by 1%, because 1% brings in 20 billion. So I don't think we've heard the last on the VAT situation.
Prof, I want to come to you because as Anthony was talking now on us being softened for that 1%, you nodded very much in agreement. You said this is not necessarily something that's off the table. We could be seeing an increase in that.
Yeah, look, I mean, not by a long shot is it off the table, and I think none of us expected it this year, but not for technical or logical reasons, for political reasons. And I think I need to make a statement in terms of where South Africa's VAT rate is at the moment. What is the more correct, logical, and technical choice in terms of taxes that are not hugely distortive or not hugely regressive? We certainly have scope for an increase in the VAT rate, and it actually would have been a better decision. But for political reasons, which I guess we won't go into now, it was not going to happen. So I think South African citizenry will be prepared, or well, in the process of being prepared, but then they'll be even more prepared for a VAT rate increase when Treasury has something to offer them in return, like national health. And I think that's what we'll see down the track. We
said earlier that people were expecting to be hit. Business wouldn't have been surprised by a business increase. Individuals would have said, okay, I'm braced for it. High net worth individuals would have as well, and maybe everyone, if you'd said 1% VAT, they'd say, well, we saw it coming. Did they waste the crisis? Did they miss an opportunity to hit people when it was the one time we were expecting it, politically?
To a certain extent, we can say they did miss an opportunity, but then if you look at the fact that VAT does affect everyone, even the poor, I think that's why then they thought, I mean, this year, let's not touch on VAT. I mean, if you look at our country, our VAT percentage is relatively low, you know, comparing to other countries in the world. But then looking at the impact it would have had, I don't think it would have been conducive to do it this year.
Jacob, let's come back to you in Cape Town. I want to read a note that we got from Chris Gilmore, and I think this just goes back to the issue we've been talking about with regards to the tax on the wealthy. And what he says is that it's been on higher properties, or he's referring to the capital gains tax, and he says there's no doubt this was a carefully managed budget which put an extra burden firmly on the shoulders of the high income earners or wealthy people in society. So even though we didn't get a tax on the wealthy, do you get a sense that this budget really does put burden on those who earn more?
It does, definitely. If you think of capital gains tax, that's triggered when an individual disposes of an asset. And typically for individuals, that inclusion rate has increased from 33 to 40%. Now, on the one hand, the individual will be paying a higher capital gains tax when they're disposing of an asset, but revenue will have to wait a certain amount of time to collect those taxes. And then in the same breath, there was mention being made about the transfer duties being increased on properties valued more than 10 million rand. So there's not many properties in and around those values that are being transferred on a frequent basis. So again, it seems to be targeting more the wealthy individuals.
But what effect will that have? I mean, have you got some sort of number here where, I mean, how many such transactions take place? Is it worth doing, I suppose, is the question, for the amount of money it's going to bring in?
I think if one looks at that, in terms of the frequency and the turnaround time in terms of which the cash will be generated for revenue, I think it's one idea to implement this change and to increase the brackets to almost tax capital gains at a higher rate. But it's not going to translate in generating that cash in a quick period of time for revenue. So while it will generate revenue in a short period, in the shorter term, it will take a bit of time to translate that money into cash for National Treasury.
We see where you mentioned something about the consumer not being able to drink alcohol, then you've got fizzy drinks, and you mentioned at the top of the show that the minister had to look for more creative ways to get revenue. This tax on sugar, this is an interesting one. How big is the scope for us to get the revenue that is needed? And I understand that Mexico has put something like this into effect. Has it worked?
It has worked, but to be quite honest, I didn't expect us to introduce sugar taxes this year. You know, I thought this was something maybe that was going to be introduced next year or something, you know. But if you look at the fact that, I mean, we have a lot of beverages that we drink that have sugar in it, so probably we can get revenue from that, but it's not going to be a significant percentage, you know.
Other views on the sugar tax? People weren't expecting it, actually.
Clearly has social consequences aimed at obesity, but it stopped at the fizzy drinks. What about chocolate and sweets? You know, so maybe that's a story for another day.
What about sugar itself, which you put into cups of coffee?
Because it's only sugar on beverages.
And what is the economic impact? What I'm trying to understand is, are these industries? I mean, again, we're asking if it's sugar in itself. What about the sugar companies, or your Coca-Colas and your Pepsis and so forth?
I've got a comment here from BDO South Africa, Keelan Snyder's tax expert there, and he's talking about the economic impact in sugar growing areas to the economy. Never mind the obesity aspect or the health aspect. And I suppose the question is it worth whatever tax you're going to raise from it for whatever damage might be done? Anthony?
Sugar as an agricultural product has been languishing in terms of the world sugar price over years now. And do you look at it in terms of our own KwaZulu-Natal, and the amount of land that was previously under sugar cane has now been released for property development and so on. And interestingly enough, in one of our SADC countries, Mauritius, again, increasingly sugarcane land is being made way for developments, new golf courses and so on. So it's probably also in line with the trend. Perhaps the price of the commodity is not what it used to be. But I think there are those factors as well.
Is it going to work? Is it going to do what they want it to do? I mean, are people going to carry on drinking the fizzy drinks and pay the tax?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're speaking to a cynic here, right? Because, I mean...
Doesn't stop people smoking the tax cigarettes.
Well, I think that's precisely the point, right? So, I mean, I think as to the impact and the impact on industry and the likely revenue generation, that's what we're going to, I suppose that's the research that will happen during the course of this year with a view to actually implementing the tax in 2017. But as to whether it'll actually curb obesity, I think the point that you made about tobacco consumption and alcohol consumption, and I don't know if anyone can remember a budget ever when those, when the taxes on tobacco and alcohol have not been hit every single year. And I think the jury is still pretty much out on whether that's had any impact at all on the consumption of that. So the cynic's view is it's a great way to raise revenue. Education is probably the best way to deal with obesity. I don't know if this is going to solve the problem.
So we're saying to fizzy drinks, welcome to the category of sin taxes.
Yes. Yes. But women have always known that chocolate is a sin because it's so nice.
But they're not touching on chocolate.
They're not doesn't touch chocolate.
Well, we've got the rest of the year to figure that out.
Jakub, let's come to you while we're talking about more interesting ways that we have seen the Minister trying to get funds. They spoke about a motor industry tax or emissions, or tax on emissions. Is this the same thing as a carbon tax? Not sure if Jakub was able to hear me there. I'm going to try and repeat my question, Jakub. In the speech, they spoke about the motor vehicle emissions tax. Maybe give us some clarity on that. Is this the same thing as a carbon emissions tax? And exactly what type of impact is this likely to have on the consumer or the industry in itself?
Yeah, I think
the carbon taxes that I'm aware of, the carbon taxes that I'm aware of are not quite the same as the emission taxes that you're referring to. But again, it seems to be more of an environmental fix by ways of tax or by means of tax. So I don't think that it will generate as much tax as one expects, but I think it is a way of increasing revenue for National Treasury.
Let's move on to this, the medical area. And that's a controversial area because there are people who say that they should be able to claim all their extra medical expenses which are not paid for them out of medical aid on tax. It's not, you can't choose it. It's not like you have a choice when you get sick or have to have an operation. What is the position? Because I know they changed it recently. I forget the detail. And now they're talking about an increase in the monthly medical tax credit allowance. Is this significant, to ask the same question there about personal income tax relief? Is this significant or does this sound significant?
No, well, I mean, I think the second part of your question is less significant than the first. The first was really about what's the deal with the medical credit, and that comes from 2013, 2014. And this is really a relief for medical expenditure, but it's almost about, let's say, SARS's operational constraints having to influence policy. So the fact that you get a medical credit purely because you belong to a medical aid without any reference to your actual out-of-pocket medical expenditure is purely because it's impossible to try to, for SARS with their limited resources, to try and vet all of that. The second point, which is what's happened this year, is just what happens every year in terms of the annual inflationary adjustment to that credit.
So it's a business as usual type comment, that.
It is a business as usual.
So it's even more business as usual than we thought.
Yeah, indeed. Can I perhaps just pick up on the point that you made about the carbon tax? So the vehicle emissions and the carbon tax are definitely two completely separate things. And this is likely to see us pay more for cars, the emissions tax.
So again, the consumer.
Interestingly, though, the thing that we're waiting for, the actual carbon tax, we didn't see anything about that in the budget at all, which I think means it's going to happen at the beginning of 2017, which is weird for me because it's far from being complete. Most of the industry players are not ready. They don't understand it. SARS is not ready. So maybe it means that there'll be further consultation during the course of the year, or maybe it means that it's just going to happen in 2017. But we don't know.
I think there will be further consultations because the carbon tax bill was issued in November 2015. So I think they are still trying to get more credible information on that one before they introduce it. So personally, I didn't expect anything on carbon taxes.
Wasn't this another one where you do one thing but it affects something else? So their business is under pressure, big heavy industrial companies, ArcelorMittal, those ones, which are battling, and then you add another tax to make life more difficult for them. So you've got to balance the revenue and the good citizenship of it against a company that's on the edge of going under.
Bear in mind, David, that the motor industry was also pulling out of an extended period of industrial unrest, strikes and so on. And some of our locally manufactured vehicles are put onto the export market. So again, I think there's some acknowledgement for some soft peddling and to allow that industry to re-establish itself.
And again, I think just looking at the consumer, I think the next segment will be a nice way to maybe start talking about corporates. A couple of things that haven't been mentioned from the Davis Tax Committee. Prof, what are maybe some of the things that you think should have been mentioned that didn't come out, maybe from a consumer perspective, before we start looking at corporates?
I think from a consumer perspective, I think everything. I didn't see anything that was missing. I think the revenue raising mechanisms that the minister has come up with, I think they're very creative, and they actually get us into the space where we need to be as a holding pattern. I'm not sure I agree with the comment that we missed an opportunity. I mean, maybe we did miss an opportunity to raise taxes, but we also got a very, very clear warning that we will have increased taxes next year. So there was a 3-year plan. For me, that was the biggest thing that came out of this, was that despite, I think, criticisms about what the minister might have said, I think we got a sense of certainty. We've got a kind of a slightly more transparent view of what is the road ahead. We all know we're in trouble. Is National Treasury, is the minister doing something to fix it? We might not agree with his plan, but we have some kind of transparency and certainty. And for the consumer as well, we know that this is, Minister Nene started the increases last year. This year we got the increases in a kind of stealth way, but we still got the increases, and they will continue for the next 2 years.
Looking, Anthony.
I think that was it an opportunity that was missed? I think that we've got to look at how budgets are approached. They're book balancing exercises, and there were considerable cuts that the minister proposed in terms of expenditure that also ran into the billions of rands. So I think it was a question of not increasing taxes for the sake of increasing taxes, but to see where, on the expenditure side, where we can also improve the fiscal finances.
I think not so much saying that they should have, but if they were going to have a big hit, this was the time. It'll be more difficult next time, because the unique combination of circumstances, this November, December, January, was that people were expecting at this time, whereas normally they are resisting it, aren't they?
Yeah, hence we're saying they missed an opportunity because everyone was expecting the increase in taxes, so they could have capitalized on that.
Welcome back. Of course, you're right here on CNBC Africa, and we are still talking about the budget with a specific focus now on the tax discussion. We do still have a panel of experts that were with us. We have been talking about the consumer that's been under pressure, but now let's talk about businesses and corporate. The minister did say that they were definitely going to be clamping down on the leakage that they've seen in terms of tax revenue that's being lost, base erosion and profit shifting. Busiwe, let me kick off with you on key things that you took away from what he said in the budget.
Okay, with regards to the business corporate taxes, I mean, we are currently sitting at 28% and there wasn't any change. I didn't expect any change, although we have a low economic growth. But now, when you look at these tax rates that we have, it's significantly above, the global and regional, taxes. So because of that, I thought, we can't have a way of moving those taxes. However, an increase also would have had a negative impact, to the country as a whole, because it wouldn't have been received well, because we've been focusing on these consumer taxes. Nobody was thinking of an increase in business corporate tax. So I think it's something that we all expected. And
Protecting the tax base, and there's been quite a lot of it from a global point of view. If we recall the stories relating to the UK and their assault on Google and Apple, those multinationals who managed with tax planning, and we talk about treaty shopping in the budget review. I think that's where there will still be and continue to be a focus of attention is. And what is an interesting observation for me is that the large business office, which was established in 2004, and in the run-up to the budget last year, there were definite rumours that this department had served its purpose and was going to be shut down. And yet it seems to have a new life. And
wasn't that part of Commissioner Moyani's restructuring? Or proposed restructuring until the finance minister?
And then, yes, I think that Praveen asked, the minister asked that that be put on hold, and I think Commissioner Moyani's response was that a lot of it was already in progress. So it's quite clear that base erosion, transfer pricing, SARS apply a lot of resources to beefing up their transfer pricing expertise, which is all part of protecting the corporate tax base.
Prof, is the amount of the effort you mentioned now, Anthony, beefing up to ensure that we are able to get these leaked funds? Speaking to an expert earlier who said maybe the effort that we're going to make sure that we are able to get these funds, is it really worth it, considering that if we look at this leakage, it really isn't that much in terms of how much we can get from revenue, or would you be in the same boat? Or?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would say it really isn't that much. I would say that we're not really sure how much is out there.
Okay.
And certainly that is SARS's approach, and in what we've seen, they generally only go after let's call it the avoidance schemes, where they are looking at not millions or tens of millions, but hundreds of millions in terms of collection. So I have to say this is probably the least surprising element of the budget commentary. The reaffirmation of the attack on base erosion and profit shifting, that's completely unsurprising. But it doesn't create any additional new law or new legislation. It simply means that multinationals must be prepared for a continued onslaught. It's happened already. In world terms, South Africa is ahead of the curve in terms of understanding the issues and going after them. As to quantifying them, I think that's where the difficulty lies. And interestingly, I must say I was very surprised, just a slight side issue, I was very surprised that our shortfall in revenue was only 11.6 billion. If we look, we were tracking the actual collection numbers up until the end of December. I didn't have the January numbers yet, but we were expecting a shortfall of close to 20 billion. So where that would have come from is very enthusiastic collection and very enthusiastic targeting, I suspect, of these kind of things. And just keep in mind that in the real world, these things don't get solved through actual quantification of amounts and saying this is what you owe. It gets solved through negotiation and settlements, and many times, or in most cases, in fact I don't know of a single case when this is not the case, multinationals will say, fine, we'll just agree to a big number of 100 million to make it go away. And so that will continue.
Yakubu, while we continue about the onslaught on making sure that we don't see tax evasion or tax avoidance, I suppose, Anthony alluded to the large business centre that was established back in 2004. It seems to now be resuscitated with a life of its own. This new information sharing, how significant do you think this is going to be with ensuring that we are able to capture as much of the tax revenue as possible?
Look, I think the theme of common reporting standard and the automatic exchange of information will create opportunities for SARS to tap into the unknown, so to speak, to exchange information with different revenue authorities, to understand what's out there. And I think this also touches on the message that was delivered in the speech around undisclosed assets abroad as well, and the amnesty around that. So I think definitely with common reporting standards, exchange of information, and the voluntary disclosure plan is being reintroduced for companies to disclose what could be sitting offshore would be additional revenue collection methods that could be applied.
Let's come to you now again. I know that you mentioned the issue around the fact that you haven't seen corporate tax. Prof mentioned that we saw a budget shortfall that was, in terms of tax, that was a lot less than was as expected. Taking into account the economy that we're in, if taxes were to increase or not, if companies are not making money, would this really make a difference?
If taxes were not going to increase, it would make a difference because we would not collect more revenue. At the moment, the burning issue is us having more revenue in order to fund the spending that we're talking about. We are saying we've got spending which is education, we've got spending which is infrastructure. Where are those monies going to come from if we do not increase taxes? You know, it's good that he mentioned that we will be having, I think about 16 billion that's going to be funded towards education, more than 2.5 billion that's going to be fund towards NEFSAs. But where is that money going to come from if we do not increase taxes?
Let's look at the next bit in his speech, which was the undisclosed assets and the talk of an amnesty. Now, I think it was 10 years ago, 12 years ago, they had
2003.
2003, there was an amnesty for people who've taken money illegally, discreetly, quietly, offshore. Let them own up and no penalties. Now that's been offered again. You've got to be careful with amnesties. If you offer them too often, people will expect them. So you say, no, it'll be fine. They'll give us an amnesty. But I'm not an expert on this at all, but apparently the issue here was interest. So yes, I've had this money offshore for the last 20 years. I'm coming clean, and then SARS says, but you must pay interest on all that tax that you haven't paid, as opposed to simply the capital amount that you've held offshore. And there was no announcement of that. So is this a problem, Anthony?
Well, there exists in our current law a voluntary disclosure program, which is the way in which one can
so like a permanent amnesty.
It's a permanent amnesty, in fact, and it works very well. In terms of offshore funds, and by the way, one of the characteristics of this voluntary disclosure program is that if you make the approach, all penalties are waived entirely. There's some interest obviously on the taxes, but you've had the use of the money, so you might be persuaded that that's a fair deal. Now, what was part and parcel, and the Minister said he wasn't dealing with it as part of the budget, but on the website a new bill was put out, which is going to be, and it's almost like deja vu, the amnesty in 2003. It's worded in a similar way, but that legislation, and I had a brief look at it before coming on air, and I think it raises more questions than what it answers. So there's a lot of work. I mean, there's time. It only kicks in on the 1st of October, and that's where I think at the end of the day, and that big push for the last 6 months of the government's financial year to 31st of March 2017 is where we'll see a lot of that money being collected by way of this amnesty.
How much money is possible? I suppose by definition we don't know, but what are the estimates?
Again, I think we're talking, and just going to the point about SARS changing its operational model and the LBC, it's noteworthy to your point that high net worth individuals are a specific target within SARS. And I think they always have been, but now that they are officially a specific target, it gives you an indication that we're not talking about tens of millions or hundreds of millions, we're talking about billions that SARS is expecting here. But just to your point about the interest element, this is one of the difficulties with the existing amnesty that Anthony was referring to. And if you think about it, for all of these individuals, there are 4 distinct issues that they are concerned about. There's the tax that they have to pay, the interest that they have to pay, the penalties, and the possibility of it being a criminal offense. Now, the current amnesty only relieves you of 2 of those things. It's not, you don't go to jail, and you don't have to pay the penalties. But the tax is still payable and the interest is still payable. And that is still off-putting for the majority of these individuals. And I think I have to add that a separate but big issue that needs to be viewed together with this is that is also an exchange control breach from the perspective of the South African Reserve Bank. And there's been nothing from the Reserve Bank saying, if you come clean, then we won't penalize you for exchange control infringement as well. And the majority of these high net worth individuals who have these funds offshore are saying, okay, we'll pay the tax, but we still don't want to go to jail for Reserve Bank infringement.
Jakub, let's come to you. We have been talking about Amnesty, but I think one of the other hot topics for this year's budget was the retirement reform. We have heard a lot of business coming forward and saying the postponement of this for another 2 years means they'll have to put more money into their systems. Are you able to just give us a sense of how much money perhaps has already been spent on these systems, and now it looks as though we have to wait for a further 2 years? Your analysis of this?
Look, unfortunately, I can't quantify the amount of money that's been spent on the systems, but certainly a number of companies have gone through processes to implement those systems, and it has been a time-consuming and a labor-intensive process that they went through. So certainly from a corporate perspective, it's a lot of time and investment gone in from their side, and a 2-year postponement on the retirement reforms does put a damper on operations from their perspective.
Can I add something on this retirement reform? Because it's important for the taxpayers to understand that the intention was not, it was not a punitive thing, you know. The intention was just to protect the taxpayers, you know, so that they, by annuitizing those, the remainder or the 2/3 of the retirement fund. So some people thought that, okay, if I'm only going to get a third, so it means I'm being punished, you know, by not getting 100% of my money.
I think this whole aspect was misunderstood in a number of ways. That proposal went through the entire legislative process, the National Assembly, the National Council of Provinces, and COSATU seemed to just pick up on it the day that the President signed the bill into law. And I think that for some time there's been a need to level the playing fields in terms of provident funds and pension funds. And I think that these measures that have now been postponed really seek to help the individual and to make him more self-sufficient for his retirement. But unfortunately, times being what they are at the moment, if you're a low-income household and you resign, you use that lump sum to pay off debts. If you're a high-income household, you go and buy yourself a yacht or some toys, you know, fancy cars and so on. And in both instances, at the end of the day, you would fall upon on the state as a burden. So I think the legislation is very well intended. Perhaps there needs to be an education process that needs to be done, but I think the principles are sound.
Well, everyone seems to say that, but politically, and I think COSATU in particular, took it and perhaps manipulated it for its own advantage. The last thing that Pravin Gordhan needed, with all the other stuff on his mind, coming at the end of the process, to also have to deal with that. But it does remind us of the political element, which is linked to tax and so on. And I suppose there was talk of tax revolt, with the government being unstable and badly led and so on, and the legitimacy of tax. Where does that sit, Prof, at the moment? Because SARS, one of the top tax collection agencies in the world, there's been rumblings about its legitimacy because of the political situation.
Agreed, and I think that also goes to the point that you raised earlier on about whether we should have seen an increase at the top bands, the most wealthy. And maybe I think it's a little bit premature, in my view, to talk about tax revolt. But certainly the bulk of the tax liability or the tax revenue collections in this country are from the wealthy individuals, and we're talking about something like less than 10% of the top taxpayers contributing more than 50% of our revenue collection, and equally from companies. So when we talk about tax revolt as a general matter, if you look at something like e-toll, that applies to everyone. But when it comes to something like personal income tax or corporate income tax, it's generally, I don't think it's on the cards, because the majority of taxpayers in that bracket are compliant, conservative taxpayers who don't, you know, they'll make their comments about corruption and inefficient expenditure and is their tax rand being used efficiently. But I don't think we're close to a tax revolt there. But it is, as a general matter, given where we're going with everything, the e-tolls, fees must fall, all of those kind of things. It's a part of that balancing act that the minister would have had to
Just as an aside, the e-toll process went through the whole legislative process, consultation process as well. They started in 2001. It was all approved, and then suddenly 10 years later everyone woke up. So And it's similar, I think, with that tax process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, while we are still talking about businesses, I was hoping that they would touch on small businesses, SMMEs, you know, because I feel that SMMEs have problem of compliance, you know. There's too much compliance issues. I mean, to get a tax clearance certificate in order to be able to get a contract, you know, it takes a lot of time. You have to go to SARS, the queues and everything else, you know. You need to get the BE certificates, all of those compliance issues. I was hoping that maybe they say, once you are registered with CIPC, you are deemed to be compliant if maybe, let's say, you earn revenue of below R1 million. I'm just making an example, you know. But anything above that, then we need these kind of documents. Because remember, these people, mostly these small businesses are run by the owners themselves. So they have to focus on compliance and stop business development. By the time they get back from those institutions with all those documents, you know, the clients are not there that they want to sell business to. Yeah.
Very good point.
And I think that brings me to my next point, Yakub, as Busisiwe was speaking there about the impact of small business. I think there's been a lot of talk of ensuring that our businesses are able to compete. Is there a chance that we could see an increase in customs duties, and you know, would this be a way to protect the non-competitive industries that we have in South Africa?
I think that we're certainly a net importer of goods, and therefore, because we're not self-sufficient in generating or producing our own goods, and we're therefore reliant on having to import the goods. So I don't think that I don't anticipate an increase in customs duty in the near future, but that's just based on the circumstances of South Africa and its ability to generate its own goods and products.
Prof, would you be in agreement?
I just need to add, in my view, the customs duty will just be another stealth tax in the sense that you don't have to specifically increase it. You just have to watch the rand value of what you're importing increase, and that automatically increases your customs value collections. And the way we're going now, where we are at the moment, and I think that's one of the reasons why customs duty ended up being one of the taxes that were in excess of what we expected. Everything else was down. Customs duty was 4.3 billion up, and I think it's because of the rand.
Yeah. You know, another issue which I saw about, which was a concern for me about the small businesses, is the issue of VAT. The small businesses, currently we have invoice basis and payment basis. Obviously, payment basis is for individuals, but the invoice basis, think of a small business. He issues an invoice, and then he's expected to pay VAT to SARS while he's still waiting for VAT, I mean for his money from the client. And most of the time they take long, others they even default. So I was hoping that maybe when it comes to VAT for small businesses, maybe they would propose that, okay, let's use the payment basis when it comes to small businesses, meaning they only pay VAT once they've received monies from their clients, because it's an issue that we know that the small clients, they always default.
Wouldn't it have been good to have something dramatic, an announcement along those lines, that we're changing the bureaucracy, we're going to make it much easier for small businesses, and therefore, you know, 50,000 people's lives are going to be much easier. And we said in our earlier discussion that a lot of the things that they were saying they were going to do were still at the exploration stage. For me, the indicator of this was the talk about SAA and SA Express being combined. So you think, now we're talking, that's what we want. But we're exploring it with the Minister of Public Enterprises, and we're seeing if we want to do this. Now that's different. That's not a dramatic announcement that makes people feel, wow, things are going to change. So where could they have done something like that, specifically in the tax area? Yes, we'll make things easier for small business, but no specifics. What would have been a good couple of dramatic things here?
Well, I think Bossis was very point about the invoice and payments basis, because when VAT came in 1990, there was an option of in other words, you just paid the VAT as you were paid by your customers, and where you extended considerable credit terms and so on, then you were funding the VAT if you didn't have that relief. And I think that, David, would have been an example of something that would have been really meaningful, fairly neutral from a tax point of view. I think it was to been a timing thing.
They'd still get the money.
And they'd still get the money, but it would have meant a lot to our SMEs, who we're trying to encourage. Big business is shrinking, and the future and the growth in our economy and our GDP is in the hands of small business.
And they also contribute towards reducing unemployment, the small businesses, you know. So if we invest more and we enable them to trade, you know, in a less stressful way, you know, we are likely to kill the problem of unemployment. I mean, if you look at big companies, they are capital intensive, or they use mostly technology, and most of them are retrenching these days, you know. So let's try and assist, you know, the small businesses and make sure that...
Well, let's ask Jakub his views on that. Was there enough comfort for small business in a budget which they said was interested in small business but gave no details?
Yeah, there were two small minor amendments for small business corporations, but nothing significant. I certainly expected there to be more provisions for the micro enterprises, for small business corporations as well. Definitely the law is there for simplifying the compliance burden that small businesses have if they apply turnover tax, but that legislation only applies to businesses with turnovers less than 1 million rand. And I was hoping that would be increased for greater turnovers, because it does simplify the tax burden and compliance for those businesses.
Prof, let me come to you. So now we have got a framework of the funds and what, you know, how we're going to get them. The deployment of these funds, looking at the budget, are you happy with where they are going to be deployed?
Do you mind if I respond to what you
yes, of course.
I suppose if you were to ask me one of the things that was on my wish list before the budget, that it's not the biggest deal, I think, but it was the thing that I was most disappointed about, it was not in. And that was the point that all of us were making about compliance, the focus on small business, and more especially, I think it needs to be said that small business don't really need a lot of incentives, or they just need us to get out of the way. And I think that's one of the things which I think points to, and this is the thing that I'm missing in the budget, the bigger points about tax administration. I think the tension between the minister and the commissioner is probably why we're not surprised we didn't hear anything. Changes in the operational model. We have to, I mean, we have to recognize that when we talk about things like tax clearance certificates, the number of complaints going to the tax ombudsman having increased exponentially, and small business not being able to carry on their business, not because they're paying too much taxes in terms of actual tax liability, but because of the administration. So traditionally, SARS has been a great, a great administrator. Not so much anymore. Maybe great at collecting taxes, not so great at respecting taxpayers' rights and getting out of the way of business. So sorry, I needed to get that rant in, because it would have been useful if the minister had given us some kind of comfort that SARS is not going in the wrong direction. Yeah. I think to your question about expenditure, again, if I can play the role of the cynic, I like the 25 billion reduction in expenditure, but from what I could see, there was 25 billion over 3 years, and the bulk of it is not this year.
Yeah, it's expenditure to be cut over the next 3 years by 25 billion, mainly by curtailing personnel spending.
Yeah, and I think I know you had that on your previous panel as well. It's easier said than done, and I'm glad that it's been said. Combining SAA and SA Express, combining ministries, and I think we'll see how that plays out. I think we're going to see a huge impact of that in the current year.
Anthony, what were some of the things that disappointed you? Prof has been vocal about his. What are you disappointed in?
I had a lot of empathy for, in terms of our current tax administration, and again, I think as a tax collecting agency, we have one of the greatest in the world in terms of efficiency and so on. But when, and that's part of my business, where one handles disputes between the taxpayer and SARS, it's not what it used to be. Previously, it was about the law, and nowadays it's about the money. And even where, if a taxpayer has an argument in terms of a dispute with SARS that has good merits, a settlement will be achieved if the taxpayer can put or leave something on the table for SARS. And that seems to drive the way a lot of tax disputes are settled. So it seems to be a complete disregard for the merits, and more about a monetary settlement.
Yeah. I also agree with Anthony. I mean, if you look at now this season at SARS, between now and end of March, March being their financial year end, they are being aggressive, you know, in the way they want to collect taxes, you know, to an extent that sometimes they would not follow procedures. I mean, one of the taxpayers that I've seen the work that we were doing with that taxpayer, you know, they did not give him enough time, you know, to respond to them. And then when the taxpayer wrote to them and said, can I please be granted an extension? And he clearly put the reasons that this is what I've been going through, please give me enough time. And they said, no, we cannot grant you enough time. So you could see that probably those auditors had a vendetta against that taxpayer, you know. Is that fair? You know, we all understand that SARS has the sole responsibility to collect taxes, but at the same time, they need to be fair to the taxpayers. Yeah.
Good place to end. They need to be fair.
Certainly, certainly. That's it for this very special installment. And of course, we have been looking at the issues around tax. A very big thank you to our guests, Busisiwe Mkleche, who's the Chief Executive Officer of BTMT Capital, Anthony Chait, Chief Executive of Zeridium, and Professor Osman Molaji, who is the Chair of the SAICA National Tax Committee. And of course, not forgetting Yaqub Jafar, who is the Associate Director for Corporate Tax at KPMG, who joined us live from our Cape Town studios.
That's right. Well, we've dealt with the big picture, we've dealt with the tax, and Nozipo is going to continue our panel discussions from all the angles on the budget this afternoon.
Have a great day.